Hi everybody, I wanted to welcome you, a warm welcome wherever you are in the world to this webinar. We've got people from the United Kingdom, the United States, we've got people obviously from Australia. Welcome from Brisbane. It's 12 midday here in Brisbane, and I'm looking forward to providing you with some thought-provoking material around the performance review, and of course it's been very topical lately. There's been a lot of conversation out there about whether the performance review is actually effective, and as we all know, there's quite a few companies that have decided to drop the performance review, or at least the ratings. I think that trend will continue for lots of reasons that I want to discuss with you during this presentation. So warm welcome. You'll notice that over on the right hand side there is there's a question box, and if you've got any questions during the presentation, please put them in the question box, and what I'll do is at the end of the presentation I will respond to those. So let's get underway. There's three things that I'm hoping that I can cover in the presentation today. One of those things is I want to familiarise you with the process of the 5 conversations. There's actually a very clear method to this approach, and I want to familiarise you with that. And I know there's some consultants online, and you might want to take this away with you and work with your clients. Some of you might be interested in looking at this in terms of how you might actually replace your performance review. There's others of you who may be looking at this as an enabler to improve your capacity to have a better performance review experience. So I want to explain that process to you. I think secondly, I'd like to explain what these 5 conversations are. Of course, as the title says, there are 5 conversations, and explain a little bit around why I've included them, what's involved, and perhaps what some of the feedback's been so far. And the final objective, I guess, out of the presentation is just to talk a little bit about performance reviews, a little bit of my research. I've spoken to 1,400 managers in this part of the world at least, and asked them what their issues are with regard to performance reviews, and I'll share that with you during the presentation. So that's pretty much what we're covering, and as I say, if you've got questions, type them in as you think of them, because then at the end of the presentation we don't have to wait for you to type them in, and we've got questions there ready to go. Okay, so I guess the first thing is what actually, what is actually wrong with the traditional performance appraisal? I guess there are 3 groups out there in the community, in the business world. There's one group that believe that performance reviews are fine as they are, and we don't need to tinker with them. That group is getting smaller and smaller by day, but there's still some very strong advocates for the traditional performance review. There's another group of people who are sitting down thinking, well, this isn't really working the way I would like it to work, and what we need to do is to change the format. We need to train managers in how to have these performance reviews. Perhaps the paperwork is too long and so forth. So if we tinker with it, we'll actually improve the experience. Now there's a third and growing group, which is another group that think we should toss it out, and obviously I belong to that group, and actually rethink how we actually, how we actually appraise employees. Now fundamentally there's a theme running through this presentation, and that theme is this, that we're really in the business of, instead of appraising employees, we should be developing them, and they aren't exactly the same thing. So I think it's a far better approach to actually look at a developmental approach. How do we actually develop employees? At the end of the day, that's going to give us all a better return on investment. But at any rate, let's have a look at some of the concerns. Now of these 1,400, and they were HR managers, I might point out, here were the concerns that they raised with me. So what I've simply done here is I've lumped them into themes, and there are 8 clear themes that came out in my own study. One of those themes was that, and these aren't necessarily in any order by the way, one of them was that it was a very costly exercise. And I guess if you calculate the amount of time we spend on reviews, plus the preparation time, plus the opportunity costs that are lost while we're doing the review, it is a fairly costly exercise, particularly if we do it twice a year. Now, the cost itself isn't an issue. It's really whether we get value for money. Do we get a return on investment? I have yet to see any research, and I've looked pretty widely, I've yet to see any research that actually shows that we actually get a return on investment for conducting the performance reviews in terms of increasing performance. So in that sense, and remember these are HR people who probably are, are very much those that are going to administer the review, but many of them told me it was a costly exercise. Another theme that came through in the research is that they can be destructive. They're not always destructive, but they can be. And I had a lot of comments made by HR managers who suggested to me that what was happening is at the end of the performance review, they were getting all sorts of requests to deal with bullying in inverted commas. A lot of it wasn't, but that was what the allegations were. And that there was a lot of difficult situations, and the HR manager was actually really earning their money after the performance review. So some of them did tell me that it was quite destructive, the process. They're often a monologue rather than a dialogue, and what usually happens is that the manager conducts this performance review in his or her office across a desk. And what happens is, because there's a laborious amount of paperwork to get through, I've heard plenty of examples where managers have not actually made eye contact for the full duration of the performance interview while they're filling out this paperwork. So, and they end up doing most of the talking. So that's an issue in itself. Another one that came up was that there was a lot of formality around the process. Often remuneration is linked to the review, so there's a lot at stake. So it's clearly quite a formal process, and as I said before, it's often conducted in the boss's office at the boss's preferred time, and so it's quite a formal process, and in which case it's not conducive to conversation. Another theme that came up is that they were done too infrequently. And, I think most organisations that have performance reviews would do it once a year. There are some organisations that recognise that that's not enough, and they've decided to move to twice a year. And I know some organisations have even moved to quarterly reviews. But at any rate, they're infrequent. With the pace of change that we have, to talk about somebody's performance 12 months ago, 10 months ago, 6 months ago, 4 months ago, it's not applicable. And so the infrequency of it was a real concern. Another concern that HR managers expressed to me is that a lot of people, particularly the managers who had to fill out the forms, saw it as a form-filling exercise, that essentially it was a bureaucratic exercise. And a lot of HR managers said to me that what happens at the end of the review is that the HR manager or one of his or her staff would contact them and say, well, where's your paperwork, or where's your electronic version, or whatever. So it sort of reinforces the idea that this is actually a bureaucratic form-filling exercise rather than a genuine attempt to increase performance in organisations. They're rarely followed up, because what happens is that normally they're filed away either electronically or paper, and what happens is that the manager doesn't look at those again for probably 12 months, and they'll have a cursory glance at them before the next review just to kind of remember what was discussed, what the ratings were, but they're very rarely followed up. And if they're not followed up, then it's pretty much a waste of time, isn't it? Because what it means is nothing's really going to change. So why do we go down that road? And the final theme that came up in the research was that people find the whole exercise very stressful. Now, there's nothing wrong with stress. We all deal with it every day. But unnecessary stress doesn't make sense. And I heard a lot of stories of employees talking about how stressed they were about their appraisal. But I also heard a lot of stories about managers and how stressed they were about actually administering or completing the appraisal process, And then a lot of HR managers, in terms of the workload and administration, were quite stressed about the process. So what you're seeing on your screen there is the 8 key points that came out of my research. So once I did that, I thought to myself, well, there must be a better way, surely. And of course, one of the ways that people think is, well, perhaps we can just tinker with it and make it a better process. But I think there's fundamentally something wrong with the tool, and I think more and more organisations are understanding that. So moving right along, what systems are out there for you? So, you know, if you're out there and you haven't got any reviews, where do you start? And if you have got reviews and they're not working, what can you do? So let's actually have a look. On a continuum, at one end, we've got the traditional approach. Now, the traditional approach is pretty much an approach where the boss sits down and rates the employee once a year in a very formal process. We have the discussion approach, where it's pretty much a dialogue rather than monologue, and the 5 conversations framework can fit into that part on the continuum. And at the other end of the scale, we've got peer group approach. So there's several companies that I know that are moving towards this peer group approach, where they're actually getting the people in their particular vicinity to do the ratings, anonymously, no doubt, but still to actually rate the employee, so it gives some validity, I guess, to the ratings. So you've got 3 options really. So let's have a look at each. So the traditional approach, of course, is the military option, where there's a superior who gives feedback to the subordinate, who passively sits there and accepts whatever their boss says. There are still many organisations out there that conduct their performance reviews that way, even though they might dress it up in other terms. It's still pretty much a traditional approach. The discussion approach is actually about developing trust and building a good working relationship and trying to break down the them and us that we're all familiar with. And so it's very much an approach where the employee does as much preparation as the manager, so that by the time the employee comes to the appraisal, they're in a position where they can talk about their own particular performance from their own particular perspective. And then we've got the teamwork approach, where we have, you know, several people in an office or in the field who will give feedback across a number of different criteria for a particular individual who happens to be one of their team members, and that information is all aggregated into some sort of report, and then the manager sits down and basically runs through the report with the particular employee. So all of these approaches have got their own strengths and weaknesses. The traditional approach is based on the concept of power, so obviously it works because there's a superior and a subordinate type of arrangement, so whatever the boss says goes. The relationship situation works well because there's a common ground or common agreement, but you can still agree to disagree, but essentially what it's trying to do is to build a better, productive working relationship up between the manager and each of his or her employees. And then you've got the peer group approach, and the strength of that, of course, is that it's there's multiple perceptions. So it's not just, as the boss, it's just not my view. This is the view collectively of the people who happen to be in the office, and this is what they think. Whether they're right or wrong perhaps is another matter, but this is certainly their perception, and therefore if their perception is pretty consistent, then it obviously has some degree of power. So the management judgment is the approach in the traditional approach, and you know, many managers think they're very objective about these sorts of things, giving people a rating, say from 1 to 5, but it's often not the case. The discussion approach means that there's a mutual agreement between 2 people about what needs to be done moving forward. And with the peer approach, it's pretty much the judgment of the peer group and the colleagues that I work with. So you've got a choice to make about where you see yourself on that continuum. And what I want to share with you, and just to position this correctly, is the 5 conversations is pretty much in that discussion phase. So there's no peer group ratings as such, but if you're ready to go down that road, by all means, and there are some companies that have done that extremely well. So what I want to share with you now is the process. So how does the 5 conversations actually work? So this is the process, and once I've completed the process, what I'm going to do then is talk a little bit about the 5 conversations themselves and why I've positioned them as I have. So you can see that they're on this chart here, you can see that there are actually 8 steps in the process, and they're all pretty straightforward. So the first step in the process is to populate a template. So what actually happens is, say, for example, if you were engaging Winners at Work to do this work for you, what would happen is that we'd ask you for a spreadsheet. And what we're looking for there is the information around the individual's emails, who they report to, and so forth. So what we're doing with that information, of course, is populating a template which will be used for a couple of purposes, which will become obvious in a moment. So we collect all that data, so that gets completed. And the second step is that we then assess the current state. So what actually happens, and I'll show you some real live data of organisations I've worked with. So the very first thing is, let's get a baseline. Where is the organisation right now in terms of its performance? And there's a couple of reasons for doing this. One is it's a benchmark, of course, and secondly, we do this again at the end of the 5 conversations to demonstrate whether or not there's been any change. And therefore it becomes a very tangible exercise, and people can say, well, that was worthwhile because we got X amount of percentage increase in whatever, and I'll show you how that works in a minute. So we assess, and the assessment is very much based on many of the ideas and the concepts that are embedded in the 5 conversations framework. It's essential to do some management training, so anybody that's going to be administering these conversations is put through a training program. It's not a long, laborious, drawn-out exercise. It's probably 2 or 3 hours at the most. We get everybody in the room, and if distance is an issue, we do this via GoToWebinar. And basically what we're doing is some of the things that we're doing today, we share with those managers and and supervisors why we're doing it, what it's all about, what benefits they'll get out of it, how they can actually go about conducting these conversations. Some organisations that I'm working with now have decided to take put a lot more effort into that management training. So taking, quite a bit of time to show people how to have conversations and what it looks like and how they go about it. So, but I think if you're going to make this a success in your organisation, it is important to give people some training, because otherwise what happens is busyness gets in the way and people just don't do this, and then of course people will blame the 5 conversations framework rather than the fact that managers aren't downing tools and actually getting involved in this 5 conversations framework. There's an online support system, and I'll share with you an overview of that during this presentation as well, because there's 2 factors that are important. Having an online system, you need to record the conversations, you need to administer them, you need a process of being able to send emails out to people. The HR person, or what we call the administrator in this process, needs to have an overview of how the organisation is going in terms of where they're up to in the conversation cycle and what some of the issues are that are coming out of the conversations, so that from an HR perspective they can actually make some changes in terms of the way they do and conduct their own particular process. Then once we've done all that, there's the first round of the 5 conversations. Now the first round means that there's 5 10-minute conversations once a month. So for example, if you started in January, that would be January through to January through to May, and you'd have 1 10-minute conversation once a month, or every manager would at least, plus every employee. And just doing that alone would make a significant difference to an organisation, because it doesn't happen. I mean, good managers, good leaders do it. They do it because they know that it's important, but the majority of managers don't do that. So they have their 5 conversations. They use the support system to help them with that, which I'll show you in a moment. We'd like to think there'll be an increase in performance, and we can in some cases demonstrate that, and I'll show you how that works in a moment. And then the next step is there's a break of maybe a couple of months because there might be a conversation around remuneration, or there might be a conversation around key performance indicators. So we give people room for that, and we also understand that there are usually seasonal issues in most businesses, and we don't want to get in the way of that too much, but we do want people to have these conversations because they make all the difference. Then there's another round of the 5 conversations. So essentially what it means is ideally every organisation goes through, everybody has 10 short, sharp conversations every year, which are based around a theme, which are of course are the 5 conversations. So that's what should happen. And some organisations have said, oh look, we can only really afford in terms of time one cycle per year. Well, that's better than not having anything, but we strongly recommend to dive straight in and start to create a culture of conversation in your workplace. Then the last step in this process is, you'll remember I said in step 2 we assess the current state. Well, we use exactly the same methodology. This is all done via email. There are 50 statements, 10 for each of the 5 conversations, and we actually ask the same questions to the same people in the same way, and then we can compare a before and after. So in 12 months' time, you'd be expecting to see some changes, otherwise you are wasting your time. But that process keeps everybody accountable. So there is a process there, it's a cyclical process, and you've got benchmarks to work with from that point of view. So that's the process. I'm just sharing with you now some data around an organisation I did this with. I won't go into great explanation about all the circles and all the pretty pictures on your screen there, other than to say you'll notice it's thematic. We've got the 5 conversations there up the top and here, so that just gives us a quick overview, and you'll notice that the input is top management, which is the CEO plus his or her immediate team. Middle management in this case is anybody who happens to be supervising anybody, whether it's 1 or 500. And workforce are those people who are not in any sort of supervisory role at all. So obviously that's the larger group in most organisations. So what this is really showing you is a quick snapshot of how the level of congruence, because the closer the circles are aligned, the better. So you can see very quickly on this that in this organisation, innovation and continuous improvement was pretty good, whereas there were some issues pretty much around learning and development in this organisation. So it opens up a conversation about those sorts of issues as well. Breaking it down a little bit further, here is a typical, well in fact this is a real life example of an organisation that's gone through this process. So Q3, which is the order it comes in the online survey, they are randomised. We don't put headings around what the statements are getting at. We just want people to respond how they see it. So Q3, it's 3rd in the list. I am aware of each of my immediate team members' work-related deficiencies. Now this is what top management and middle management would have responded to. You'll notice down the bottom you've got workforce, or that's workforce. In this case we've got 33 in this company. And what this organisation, their question would have been slightly different. It would have been he or she is aware of each of his or her immediate team members' work deficiency. So they're responding from the point of view of how they observe their leader. So essentially it's the same question, but just looking at it from 2 different dimensions. So if you have a look at these results, they're very interesting because you've got top management. In this case, there were 3 in the senior team, and all 3 of them said, yes, I'm very aware, or 100%, so that's a very positive result. Middle management, there were 5 in this team, again 100%. So obviously anyone in a supervisory or management role in this organisation was very positive that they actually knew or know what the deficiencies of their employees are. But what was interesting about this is if you have a look at the workforce, sure, it's defaulted to an agree, but have a look at the numbers. 45%, that's 15 out of 33, said, yeah, I agree, I think my boss does know my deficiencies. However, 46% couldn't bring themselves to agree or disagree with that statement. In other words, they didn't know. And 9% said, no, I don't think he really does or she really does know. So what that suggests to me, looking at that and having a lot of experience with this, is that what that suggests is that it's probably true that the leaders in that organisation do know the deficiencies of their team, but probably what hasn't happened is there hasn't been a conversation about that to the extent that it should be, and that's why the workforce is not quite as positive. In other words, these people sitting on the fence who couldn't bring themselves to agree probably weren't sure because their manager hadn't actually mentioned anything to them. And so that could be the reason for that. So the next time round, as I said with that cycle, we get the same statements there, and we can actually measure literally before and after whether or not that particular response is improved or gone backwards. So here's the conversation on innovation and continuous improvement, just to show you one more example. Here's the statement: my direct reports have made suggestions to me about ways to improve efficiency and effectiveness in the organisation. So, top management, yep, I've had suggestions come back from, in this case it'd be middle management. Middle managers have said, yeah, I've had some, but 2 of them couldn't bring themselves to agree with that. And the further down you go in the organisation, the less positive people are about that. Remember, the question the workforce would have answered there is he, if it's a he or she, or her, she, sorry, it should be I have made suggestions about ways to improve the efficiency and effectiveness in the organisation. So again, we're expecting better results after 2 rounds of the 5 conversations. All right, so just a change of pace. So that's the process, that's the tool that we use, and so I want to make a statement here. So why am I going down this road? Why am I so obsessed with having conversations? And it's not just having a chit-chat, as you probably could realise. It's quite focused, certainly not as stressful as a performance review, but it's certainly very focused. And I'm making a provocative statement here, and some of you would have heard me making this statement before, but the roles that people play in organisations are actually more important than the jobs they do, which sounds a little bit controversial. What I'm not suggesting there is that technical competence is not important. It is. We expect people to have competency at work. Absolutely, no question. However, it's true that there are lots and lots of things that people do in the workplace that actually add up to performance that are often not contained within that dreaded document called the job description. In other words, there's a whole series of roles that people play in organisations that are critically important to the performance of an organisation. So let's have a look at those. So I'm just going to talk about the work that people do here, and just for a moment, the work that people do. Let's actually look at it. There's 2 types of work that people do. There's the roles that people play, the job role, which is their technical job, no matter what it is, whether it's a trade or whether they're a professional. Usually that information is captured in the job description. So yes, we do talk about some of those things in the 5 conversations, absolutely. But this isn't an opportunity just to sit around and talk about a project, as a convenient opportunity to talk about progress on a project. But there's some non-job roles that people play in organisations as well. And I've selected 4 of those that I think are critical. So these aren't actually, they're not normally included in the job description. So let's actually have a look at them. I've picked 4 that I think are critically important. One of those is a positive mental attitude and enthusiasm. I actually expect people to come to work with a reasonably good frame of mind, a can-do approach, solution-focused. They may not bounce off the walls with great enthusiasm, that's not what I'm getting at here, but they're not being negative and attempting to sabotage the organisation, because that's in effect what people do. And I can guarantee that every one of you could actually identify somebody who doesn't fit that bill. So I think that's an important role that people need to perform in the workplace. Another role that I think people need to perform in the workplace is the team role. I'm actually expecting that people will be a team player. Why? Because there are so many teams in organisations. They work in permanent teams, they work in semi-permanent teams, they work in spontaneous teams. People have to learn the skill of being able to work with other people. That is a role that is critically important to performance. Another role that's critically important to performance is the skill development role. We actually want people to, I guess, bring their brains to work and continually learn and grow. And again, every one of us in this webinar would know people who clearly have stopped learning. And that manifests itself by people saying things like, oh, it's not in my job description, I'm not, I don't want to do that. Or I'm too old to go to that training course, perhaps you should send somebody else. Or I don't want to use this new software because I've been using this software for a long period of time. So things like that. So we're actually expecting people to continuously grow in their role. Another role, and the final role here, that I think is critical, and it's not the final because there are probably a whole bunch of other roles, but the four that I've identified is innovation and continuous improvement. Yes, we expect people to bring their thoughts and ideas to work and actually assist the organisation to be more efficient and effective. Absolutely. And we have a lot of trouble with this, and I think it's because we're not asking the right questions. And you'll probably gather that one of the conversations is actually the innovation and continuous improvement conversation. We're actually having a conversation about that. Because by having a conversation about that, we're likely to unearth some of the great ideas that people have got in their heads that are not prepared to say anything for all sorts of reasons. Now, if you have any doubts about this business of non-job roles and how critical it is to performance, consider this. A survey was done in 2014 by Warner, and basically it was a pretty simple survey, but it was a comprehensive one. 9,000 people, 9,000 managers were asked a simple question. If there was one important attribute that you would expect in your employees, what would it be? That was the question that was asked. And what you're seeing on your screen here is the 10 top attributes. So all of this information was aggregated, and what you've got in front of you is the 10 top attributes that people are expected to have at work. Now, what's interesting about that list, and we don't need to go into great detail, but what is interesting about that list is that there's nothing technical on that list. So there's an assumption that people will come to work with their, with a skill set, of course, but beyond that, there are more valuable things that are critical, and and you'll notice that a lot of the things that I've just talked about are actually on the list. Number 7, working in a team. Number 1, enthusiasm, positive attitude. So it's clear that that's what we all expect, those things. We want those things. So it becomes a critically important part of the exercise. So getting down to the 5 conversations framework, here is this screen actually shows you the 5 conversations. And you'll notice that over on the left-hand side, there is 5 months. This can be started at any particular time. The middle column shows you the topic of conversation, and so we've got and there's no accident. There's an order in this that's important, and I'll explain that in a moment. And then we have a little bit around the content of what will be covered in those conversations, and then we have some of the key questions that are going to be asked in that conversation. Now, a lot of people might think, well, I can't imagine a conversation going from, 10 minutes. Surely it would go longer. I can say to you that in some cases it has gone longer, but it's gone longer because a decision, I guess, has been made to go longer. But the whole process is designed to have 10 short, sharp conversations. So there's only a few questions to be asked. and answered. And I guess it's probably bringing people together to do what they should be doing anyway, which is talking about development. So the climate review, for example, which is month 1, and of course you can start that process anytime. It doesn't have to be January, it could be in September or whatever. So in month 1, for example, the very first question that the manager will ask the employee is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? Now, the employee can say 6 or 3 or whatever, it doesn't matter. The next question is why, which gives a little bit of an elaboration about the score. And then, of course, the conversation ends up being around how could we perhaps improve your job satisfaction, or why is it the way it is. Now, we spend tens, hundreds, and even millions of dollars every year on these engagement surveys online. And, you know, what happens is that information is often, buried away somewhere in a file, and very little is done with it. This is actually the engagement survey. Could you imagine your whole organisation having conversations around this? The manager is in the conversation. They're aware of what people are saying. They can actually make changes fairly quickly in some cases on things that they hear, and I've heard plenty of examples of that. So, and people might say, oh yes, but maybe people won't be honest with their manager. Well, that's the very reason they should be having the conversation, because there's no trust. People aren't necessarily honest online either. So there's no perfect way of collecting information, but I think by being in a conversation, the manager can ask questions around why'd you say that and so forth. It can bring out interesting information. Month 2, we move into a strengths and talents conversation. The strengths and talent conversation is very much starting with what people are actually good at. What are their innate talents? Because what happens is we usually go straight for the jugular and talk about all the negative things that people do, and of course it just creates this downward spiral of negativity, and no wonder the performance reviews become quite negative. So let's start with what people are good at. And again, the employee actually comes to these conversations prepared. So they're not blindsided. They've actually thought about it. They know what the questions, what the likely questions are. They've actually prepared online to answer those questions, and I'll show that to you in a moment. And so they're ready to go. And the manager's just got to open up the dialogue and they have their conversation. Month 3 is probably the most difficult of all 3 conversations, and that is the opportunities for growth. So this is where we can talk about weaknesses and areas that need to be improved, and obviously that does have to be talked about. But again, the employee comes to that conversation nominating no more than 2 areas that they can work on, and the manager may agree or disagree with their understanding of what they think are their areas to improve or grow in, and they have a conversation about that. And the manager talks about how they might support them in that process. Then there's a learning and development conversation. Now, this is your training needs analysis, and again, we spend hours and hours collating all this information about learning and development. You can actually collate all this on the online system through the simple conversation around learning and development. So you can imagine we've talked about strengths, we've talked about weaknesses. We're now in a position where we can actually talk about what we can do about building on those strengths and overcoming those weaknesses. That's the L&D conversation in month 4. And look, let's face it, a lot of that learning development is not sending people off to training courses. A lot of that is actually on-the-job coaching. So a lot of that can be done very much by taking a priority or taking some time to show people how things are done. And then month 5 is as I said earlier, is the innovation and continuous improvement conversation. That is the conversation around ideas for making the organisation more efficient and effective. Now just think for a minute, imagine, and some of you I know are sole traders, but those of you who are managers in your own business, or managers in a business, or even in the public or private sector, can you imagine what it would be like to know that, say, right now in December is conversation on innovation, continuous improvement, that every single person in your organisation is having a conversation about that? Now, that's powerful. There's going to be some great things come out of that conversation, particularly when the employee is expected to come to that conversation having thought about that. So they're not sitting there saying, with their arms folded, their eyes crossed, saying don't know. They're expected to come to those conversations with ideas. A lot of those ideas won't be practical, but you can be sure that there'd be some good ones that can be implemented immediately. So that's how you create this learning, this learning organisation that Peter Senge was talking about 25 years ago, by actually talking about those things. So in a nutshell, there's the 5 conversations framework, and I can answer any questions that you might have offline or online, depending on the situation. So just summing up, and then what I'll do is I'll take you in and have a look at the system very briefly, so you can see the online system and how it works. Essentially, there are 5 benefits of this approach. One is it creates an ongoing dialogue between the leader and the people he or she leads, rather than a once a year or twice a year big event where people down tools and have these very stressful and artificial reviews. Another particular benefit is that it creates openness and directness. So openness in the sense that we're talking about things, direct in the sense that the questions are designed to get straight to the heart of the matter. Now again, that builds trust, and trust in an organisation is a priceless commodity if you've got it. And if you haven't got it, it's very costly. So anecdotally, we're finding people are saying that they're getting a huge amount of trust generating by having this open, regular dialogue. A third approach is that it's flexible. It can be done on a park. These conversations can be done on a park bench. They can be done in a car. They can be done in the lunchroom if it's available. They can be done anywhere. It's very, very simple to do. So it's not, and in fact, we encourage people to get away from the manager's office and to have these conversations. Another benefit is it's timely. Obviously, the manager's hearing directly at that time what's happening, and they can do something about it immediately if they choose to do that. If they don't, they can be held accountable by their particular employees if they promise something. And it's way more relaxed, much more productive, and people, we are finding, are thoroughly enjoying the approach. The typical comment I'm getting from employees is, this is great, I'm spending more time with my manager, it's wonderful to have that opportunity. And managers are saying to me, it's great because I'm actually hearing what's going on. I've got my finger on the pulse, and these conversations are useful for that reason. So there's lots of good reasons for doing that. So let me just take you into this portal. So you notice on your screen there, we've got just a couple of things about this. Okay, I'm going to have a mock conversation between Huey Duck and Donald Duck. So Huey is actually an employee and Donald is his manager. Now I'm Huey, I'm the employee, there's his name there. This is conversation 1, which is climate review. It's very simple to use. All Huey has to do is click on start my conversation. Whoop. It's been sitting there a while, I'd suggest. Whoop, wrong person. So what you can see there is these are the questions that are asked in the conversation. So Huey is preparing to have his conversation with Donald. Now Huey receives an email with a link, so that he just has to click on the link and it takes him straight in here. And as I said before, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? Huey rates himself. Huey then says why, so he can write anything in there that he chooses to or not. You can exit at any time. It'll save the information, but we'll go to the next set of questions. Scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate morale in the team? There's a rating there. There's a reason for it. Next, scale of 1 to 10, how would I rate communication within the team? Why do I rate it as such? Next. Scale of 1 to 10, communication outside the team, and next. and then anything else you'd like to say. So all that's done prior to the conversation. Then there's a button there that finalises. Now, once that's clicked on there, it just asks whether you want to go back or you're happy to finalise. I've decided that I'm going to finalise, and what that does is says thank you, and that Donald will be in contact with you shortly to have your conversation. So if I then go to my Outlook, and click send and receive. Sometimes takes a little while. Murphy's Law. So what happens is this is all automated as such, and they're not the emails that I was after. So what happens is that really there's no escaping the fact that these conversations are critical. There we are. So if I just blow that up a little bit, I'm Donald. I'm sitting in my office or wherever I'm working, and it just says there that Huey, one of my team members, completed their preparation and they're ready for you to have a conversation with them. So basically what that means is that Donald has to make time now to talk to, Donald has to make time now to talk to Huey. And if I go back to where I was, and this is just a demonstration one, of course. So if I go back to, I have my conversation, and then Huey, now we've had our conversation. Huey goes back to his particular portal, and you'll notice there's a new button there that says conversation complete. Now, what's interesting about this is the employee can then monitor the process. So we're actually equalising this a little bit so that the employee has some say in this. So when Huey, remember Huey's the employee, when he clicks on that button, it's asking him, and the conversation is now complete. So Huey's indicated that the conversation is now complete. So if I go now, navigate back to Donald, you will notice now that in this case here, Donald has 3 employees or 3 people in his team, one of which is Huey. Huey, you'll notice there that the status is actioning, so that means that I'm actually in a position now where I have to go in and put some actions down, and all I need to do is action responses, and that takes me to, remember this is Donald, I can now see what Huey has said. I've heard what Huey had to say because I've had a conversation, and I can actually also include my comments based on that. So it keeps a record, and as you can see, it's a very simple process. You'll notice that there's another button there that's adding, that can add action, so that gives this opportunity. We're running short of time, but I'm happy to show any of you that chooses to have a look at this in more detail. But essentially this is an action plan, so there might be a step or something I need to do. By clicking on that process there, I can create an action, and I can also email that. See up here, I can email that to my inbox so I won't forget. So because we want lots of actions to occur out of these conversations, that's the whole point of it. So that we're actually creating a more harmonious working environment. So that gives you a bit of a nutshell how it works. And as I said to you before, at any stage that you've got that you would like to have a look at this process, more than happy to do that. So let's go back to the presentation. So just to give you a taste of how it works, which pretty much brings us to the end of the presentation, and I'm sure we've got a few questions to be answered. Just a little plug here, if I may, and that is that if you send me an email within the next 24 hours, I'm more than happy to post you out the book. That's the end of the performance review with a 20% discount. More than happy to do that, but I need to receive an email from you within the next 24 hours, and I'll send that out and I'll sign it for you, and that will give you much more detail about how the process works and why I've decided to go down this road of having those 5 conversations and all the benefits that are there for you. So, which brings us pretty much to the end of the process, and I'm just now going to have a bit of a look at the actual questions that we've got. Don, you're mentioning here that you can't see or hear you. I'm sorry about that. I hope I haven't lost you as a result of that. I don't know how many other people are in that boat, but if there is, let me know, please. Not that there's much I can do about it other than reschedule. But we've still got a lot of people online, so it probably is okay. So here's a question that I have from somebody. Somebody's asking this: how do you link the 5 conversations with remuneration? That's a good question, because there's lots of organisations that actually link, particularly in the United States, they link their performance review with the remuneration. I don't actually think that's a good thing to do, because I actually want to have a genuine conversation with somebody, and there might be another conversation that's guided and informed by the 5 conversations. So in other words, I would separate the remuneration conversation from these other conversations. I would not tag it on to the end. That's not the purpose of the exercise. And in fact, if you do that, obviously the employee is aware of it, and they're probably going to be very stifled in their responses, and you're probably not going to have a very genuine conversation. So I strongly urge you to separate those. But yes, it's true that the 5 conversations should guide and inform decisions around remuneration. Absolutely, as should be your observation of the person, your feedback from customers. There's a whole lot of things that should go into that decision-making process. So to answer your question there, Frank, I would just say separate them. I just don't think it's a good idea to go down the road of actually having them together. Another question here around the process of the actual process. It's asking the question, if a new employee arrives in the workplace halfway through the conversations, do they start at the beginning? Another good question. I would strongly urge, so the corporate, what we call the corporate conversation might be in conversation 3, which is essentially the opportunities for growth. So everybody in the organisation is in conversation 3, and you've got a new employee that's arrived there, and then do they involve themselves in conversation 3? I would strongly suggest, and there's no hard and fast rules about this, but I'd strongly suggest that you do complete the first 2 conversations. And admittedly, asking people about their job satisfaction, it's likely to be a 9 in the first day, and if it's not, it's a bit of a problem. But at least you can get a bit of rapport going and go through what they see as their strengths. That could be a very valuable conversation, and then you can launch into the corporate conversation around opportunities for growth. So in that sense, that's the way I would go about that. But the whole purpose of having a conversation a month is that from an HR or organisational perspective, there's themes running, that every month has a theme, and that way it's great because HR can tailor a lot of its approaches to that particular theme, and they can do things around that theme. For example, if we knew it was conversation 4, which is learning and development, then all that information via the portal I just showed you is actually available to the administrator, who is a person who actually has access to all that information across the organisation. So they can collect all that data across the organisation, and that gives them a great opportunity to actually create their own training needs analysis as a result of those conversations, which saves HR a huge amount of time and effort. It divulges responsibility back to the supervisors, which is always a difficult, tricky thing in organisations, and everybody's benefiting. So that's why we have a theme each month. But of course, if people arrive at certain times during the cycle, they would slot in, but there's no reason why they can't also involve themselves in the previous conversations as well. Another question here, the cost of the process. Yes, it's, look, I'll share that offline. I think if you've got an interest in this approach, I would be more than happy to talk to you, not because there's anything secret. I just need to explain it in a bit more detail. I'm not convinced that everybody in this webinar today wants to know that, but yes, I will share it with you. So send me an email and I can share it with you. It's pretty cost effective, let me say, and you'll find that you will know whether you get value for money very easily. And how do we know that? Well, because we've got a before and after survey result which would indicate whether there has been any change in the culture. So you can see that what we're trying to do here is actually create a culture, a conversation culture. So it's actually, in many respects, a change management process, and the benefits for that are quite significant. And it always comes back to the simplicity that we're actually dealing with people here, and because we're dealing with people, we're actually wanting people to be. We need to engage with people. And unfortunately, a lot of the humanity is taken out of workplaces in this day and age. And at the end of the day, it's just organisations are simply people who are all working together for a particular cause or reason. It's as simple as that. So we need to make sure that we're connecting and engaging with people, and that's essentially the philosophy behind it. And that doesn't mean it's, wishy-washy. In fact, in many cases, it's not. And that's the whole reason that people don't do it, because they're afraid of actually broaching some of these subjects. And that's why people don't do these conversations the way they should. And then they wait for the performance review. And then what happens at the performance review is they hit them right between the eyes with all this feedback over the last 12 months, which isn't effective and could cause World War III, and often does. So the irony is, if you actually look at performance reviews, they actually stifle conversations, because if a lot of managers know, because they're having a review, they just say, right, well, I'll just wait until the end. I'll just wait for the review and I'll hit them right between the eyes. Okay, so that looks like it might be all the questions that we've got. So by all means, send me an email, indicate if you'd like a copy of the book, and if you've got any questions, and if you'd like me to go through the online system in more detail, I'm more than happy to do that. Just send me an email. Thank you very much for your participation. I hope you found it very informative and useful, and have a really nice break if you're having a break over the Christmas period, and we'll talk to some of you in the new year. Thank you very much.